Hello, everyone, and welcome to the trick to passing your next compliance audit. What will you say when an auditor comes knocking on your door? A couple of housekeeping things that we want to get to before we get started. First is this session is being recorded, so you'll be able to view it later and you'll get an email notice to that fact. Secondarily, we are going to have some polls, so we got you all to participate in those polls, so please share your opinions. And then finally, we're also going to encourage everybody to ask questions of our expert of the day. And with that, let's welcome Stuart McIrvine, Vice President of Product Management for CA Technologies. Stuart, welcome.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be here.
Our pleasure. All right, let's go to the first topic then. Let's talk about a hybrid IT environment. And what does a mainframe, or where does the mainframe actually factor into the overall strategy somebody might have around data, identity, and application security?
So the mainframe is a very big factor, but one of the things I'd like to point out is, in your typical organizations, I work with, customers every day. I work with a large range of customers, all with mainframe systems. And typically what I find is that the Chief Information Security Officer usually is a lot more focused on the distributed environments rather than the mainframe. The mainframe team is usually somewhat separate. It's a much older platform. So one of the keys is it's often kind of separated. Now, there's obviously, there's this consideration too that, the mainframe's never been breached, and, I'll kind of talk about that, a little bit later. So it should be a safe platform. We just kind of leave it and it operates itself. It's critical that the mainframe is an integrated part of the overall security environment, right? That's one thing that we continue to stress with our customers. And one of the reasons that it's so important is so much of corporate data actually resides on that mainframe platform. Mainframe's been around for over 50 years now. It's been collecting data, for that period of time. There's a lot of data up there. Another statistic that I'll throw out is that 70% of the world's transactions today still run on a mainframe. And if you think of the type of data that's handled by transactions, it's usually sensitive data. There's a lot of account information, personally identifiable information, financial information, etc. So if we've got about 3/4 of the world's transactions running on this platform, we've probably got most of the world's sensitive data sitting up there too, right? So it has to be an integrated part of it, and not kind of separated from the rest of the organization. And I will say there are certain areas which on the mainframe has less advanced aspects of security. Let's say it's a highly securable platform, but some of the more advanced security technologies, multi-factor authentication, privileged access management, are slowly coming onto the mainframe now. So you'll see there's some of these technologies are still a little bit behind on the mainframe. They're available, it's just the adoption of them tends to be a little bit slower up there.
So do you think, therefore, that customers are kind of taking compliance audits for granted? I mean, are enterprises preparing for the next compliance audit on their mainframes?
They certainly are. The customers, the clients that I continue to work with, probably a big part of their day, their week, their month is spent, preparing for, avoiding audits, trying to make audits easier. There's a significant, I'm sure everyone on this call understands the level of effort and the level of cost in preparing and actually going through an audit. So it's certainly very, very top of mind, right? It's very, very significant. But, most organizations know where their risks are, right? And they know, therefore, the time and effort in dealing with those risks as they get through audits. Let me give you one example of something, I come across fairly often. On the mainframe, it's such a critical platform. If that mainframe goes down, companies can be losing up to millions of dollars per hour, right? So the availability of that platform is critical. And there are key personnel that if there's a system outage, they're called in to very quickly try and rectify any problems, get that platform back up and running again. These type of individuals need very extensive access to the system, right? They have very privileged IDs. They can go on. They can manage the databases, the transaction systems, everything else, right? Now, that's an area of risk. You have to set up these very sensitive IDs on the system. If someone has access to these IDs, they can do anything they want. They can bring the system down, right? They can take databases off. They can delete sensitive data, etc. So the protection of these IDs is critical. Now, here's one of the dilemmas, and I see this a lot. Often, let's say a system goes down 2 a.m. Sunday morning, and Mike gets called up because he's one of the go-to guys that can bring the system up, but Mike's not available, right? So now we call Sarah, who's equally good, and Sarah's available, and she comes in, right? Typically, what happens is these very sensitive IDs, they're shared, right? Both Mike and Sarah have the password, right? That's a huge audit failure area. So a lot of compensating controls have to be built around that, right? So there are areas that, I talk to a lot of our customers, right, on how they protect these IDs, add additional access controls, etc. Around them. But, back to your original point, yeah, a great deal of time and effort does go in, with the mainframe team to preparing for those audits and trying to make these audits easier and less costly.
All right, folks, and that brings us to our first poll, which is, does your organization have formal processes in place for tracking mainframe data from internal threats? And the poll is now open, and our potential answers are yes, no, it's a work in progress, and it's okay to say, I don't know. All right, I think we gave everybody enough time to answer the poll. Regulatory ecosystem that people are trying to navigate. So, Stuart, let's go to the first question here. The regulatory sphere is expanding. How do you identify the most important regulations to consider for your business?
The most important, that's a tough one because really, let's start with the ones that you're going to have to deal with, right? So, for example, if you're in the healthcare industry, right, you're going to have to deal with HIPAA. It is inevitable you're going to get a HIPAA audit because it's critically important that patient healthcare information is protected. Okay. So the industry specific, if you're in an industry, if you're in banking, you're going to deal with Gramm-Leach-Bliley, which certainly has clauses that, focus on, protecting, customer information, etc. Other areas, one mandatory, compliance is going to be around, if you handle credit cards, right? If you're a retailer, if you're a bank, or any type of organization that handles credit cards, you're going to deal with PCI, right, as well. So there are certainly many industry-specific, regulations. There are cross-industry regulations. PCI is a great example of that. And there are even now, I will say, international regulations that cross geographic borders. One of which is probably everyone's very aware of, came into effect in May of this year, is the General Data Protection Regulation, aka GDPR. So that really has a worldwide scope, very focused obviously in the European Union, but everyone really has to pay attention with that one. And that one is really trying to tighten the screws on the management of personally identifiable information, right? And it really does step up the game quite a bit compared to previous PII regulations. There's a lot of processes and procedures that need to change in order to be in compliance with it. One of the key areas I should highlight is that with GDPR, as an organization, if you manage personal information of somebody, that individual has the right to be forgotten. They can say, look, okay, I no longer want you to have my personal information. You therefore need to be able to find every location that is stored and delete it, right? And that can be a tall order, right? If I go back to mainframe here, right? The mainframe's been collecting a lot of this information for, potentially over 50 years, right? So going back and trying to find that information and ensuring that it is actually deleted and that person is forgotten can be extremely difficult. So we're seeing a lot of regulation around PII and some fairly stringent requirements, in this whole area. But one thing I should highlight is when we think about regulations, most of the regulations are focused clearly on data, right? Data is, I don't think anyone would argue with me, it has to be the most regulated artifact in IT today. There are more regulations around data than anything else, right? So when you're asking about regulations, what you're dealing with, these are typically the ones, right? Anything to do with data, whether it's PII, it's financial data, or even confidential data, right, etc. But typically they're around data.
Okay. So if that's the case, then are the standard procedures that people relied on all these years as far as mainframe compliance was concerned, are they changing? And if so, how?
They're certainly changing. So, I sound so repetitive because I keep talking about how long this platform's been around. But, it's important to note that because, I've highlighted it's been around for over 50 years. And, 50 years ago, there really weren't that many regulations. Organizations were quite happy to collect personal information. Data was king. Data's king today, it was king back then, okay? So, with the lack of regulations, right, there weren't too many procedures and policies on how that data was collected and stored, etc., right? So all of that, as we've evolved, as the regulations increase, the policies and procedures have to change, right, in order to maintain compliance now. So we're certainly seeing a lot of that. Companies now are spending a lot of time trying to figure out, first of all, where their data is, right, where their sensitive data is, being able to classify that. And it's critically important to be able to classify it because I want to know, is this data financial data? Is this data PII, for example? Because there are different levels of risks, there are different regulations, right? So I have to understand where it is, what class of data I have, and I also need to be able to protect it. So all these procedures for scanning and classifying and protecting key fields or key records of data are all now starting to be put in place. And the technologies are there now for the mainframe to help make that more cost effective, right? Reporting is critical now. Understanding, and it's not just reporting that, hey, I can show off and say, I know where all my data is and, and I can prove it to you, but it's reporting on general security. Being able to prove that who your privileged people are, who your privileged identities are, who has access to what, etc. And be able to, when an auditor asks, you can provide the reports that just really show you've got your shop in order.
All right, cool. Well, that brings us to our next topic in the poll. So let's see where we're going to wind up here. And we're going to ask folks, which of the following mandates applies to your organization? Check all that apply. Our choices are GDPR, HIPAA, PCI DSS, SOX, and FIPS 42. I'm sure there's a lot more than everybody can count these days, but let's see what the results have to say. Well, 75% of our folks so far look like, I think some folks are still voting. Wait a minute. Okay, and here we are. So poll results would show 60% have GDPR, 40% HIPAA, 40% PCI DSS, 40% SOX. Stuart, does any of this surprise you?
No, not really. These are very typical numbers.
Okay. Well, then let's go to the next slide here for a second, which is, what's the fundamentals of regulatory readiness? And I guess everybody here kind of wants to know, like, what are the basics of a typical audit and what are auditors looking for?
Good question. Because I guarantee many people on the call haven't necessarily been at the sharp end of an audit. So therefore, what's really involved? A lot of pain, a lot of tears, right? but realistically, your typical audit starts with the auditor really doing a review of the organization. The auditor, he or she really wants to understand the landscape, wants to understand, what are the business strategies? What are the key areas that are important to the company, right? What are the key strategies and objectives? Because that helps align around the important areas, right? They want to understand the various job roles and what responsibilities, are attached to these various roles, right? People are key in audits, and what people are allowed, and that's more importantly, what people are authorized to do is critical, right? The auditor will then look at the current policies and procedures that are implemented, right? Another big area is disaster recovery. What kind of plans do you have if a disaster happens? So that first phase is really about the review. It's understanding the environment, the roles, and some of the policies and procedures, etc. Right? Once that is all understood, the next part, the auditor will then really kind of outline what the audit objectives are. Okay, and the auditor will do that in key areas. They'll have certain objectives around access control. What they want to see, data management. How is data being managed? What's the overall governance? They'll certainly want to see disaster recovery. They want to understand the objectives there and be able to assess that. Change management is critical, right? One of the areas of most vulnerability in an organization is when a change is made, right? That's quite often when you will open up a vulnerability. So auditors will pay a lot of attention on change management. Do you have good change management processes in place? So they will spend a lot of time on that. For that reason I just gave, it's a huge area of vulnerability. And then of course they're going to look at the key controls that you have, right? Controls that are defined by a lot of the regulations, SOX, whatever, etc. So once that's all been outlined, there's the objectives. Then they'll actually go into the audit, and the audit itself, they will interview a lot of people. Sometimes, everyone's getting prepared for, you're going to be prepared. You could be interviewed. You may not know until the day that you're actually going to be interviewed. You're interviewed about your role. You're interviewed about how much do you understand the various procedures. Do you understand the controls, and do you adhere to these controls, etc. So there's a lot of that interviewing that goes on. There's an assessment of devices, equipment, right? Are they operating correctly? So that will go on. There's a lot of reading of reports, right? You'll be asked to maybe publish a report. They'll read the report. Do they have the right content? Is there enough information for them to assess controls or whatever it is, etc. So once that is all done, then really the next phase is the auditor providing the report of how that audit went. So that report will certainly cover all findings. It will be extremely extensive. And it will certainly highlight the failure areas. If you're lucky, there'll be none of these. Very few of us are that lucky, And so the report will highlight the the areas that are in need of remediation, right? And what kind of additional controls are probably required. Or in some cases, there are some cases where an audit will say you're failing in this area. We understand that it's close to impossible to stop doing that bad activity, let's say. So I want to see a compensating control in place that reduces the risk around that, right? Because often it's impossible to completely eliminate the risk. I'll go back to the point I made earlier about having these shared IDs. When I talked about Mike and Sarah both being critical resources that are able to bring a system back up, you don't want to have multiple highly privileged IDs. You want one that you can keep control of and share the password. That might be the only way to do it. So you've got to make sure there are a lot of controls around that ensure that only Sarah and Mike know the passwords, right? That password gets rotated frequently, maybe every use and things like that. So these are some of the things they'll come back with. Say, look, there is a risk in this area. We know it's impossible to completely eliminate the risk. You've got to prove to me that you can control that risk significantly.
All right, well, let's move over to best practices then for achieving compliance. And I guess there's a lot of ways to go about this, but the first question I would just ask you is, are there any specific security challenges that apply to the mainframe or compliance challenges that people should be thinking through?
The mainframe it deals with a lot of the same challenges that distributed systems deal with. That's certainly true. There's not a lot unique there. What I will highlight is one of the key differences is on the mainframe. Typically, a mainframe implements mandatory access control, and just in case it's unclear what I mean by that. Versus discretionary access, which is more common on distributed platforms. And if you look at your laptop today, when you get your brand new laptop and you open it up, you get access to everything on that. It's discretionary, and then I can start locking things down. I can start putting passwords and stuff and limit it, right? On a mainframe, it is the other way around. It is typically nobody gets access to anything, right? Until such time as that individual is authorized. They're given the ID, they're given the permissions, etc., to authorize that. So that's one thing that's quite different. But some of the areas that I would say the mainframe is behind distributed platforms on are areas like multi-factor authentication. The technologies are there today. We have the technology, we have the software to help companies do that. There's very limited adoption. We're working with a few large organizations today who are implementing multi-factor authentication, and for very good reason. One of the biggest areas of vulnerability on the mainframe is someone hijacking your ID, right? They come in and they manage to get your password, they log on as you, and that's why managing these privileged identities is so critical too. Because if someone managed to hijack a privileged identity, they have very extensive access to the mainframe. So having something like multi-factor authentication is critical to make it much more difficult to steal IDs, right? I need a password and a token as well, etc., in order to be able to log on. So adoption is slow with multi-factor, even though the technology is there. Another area is being able to have additional controls and tools to manage these privileged IDs. Okay, today a privileged ID is pretty much treated like, or you have it's treated much the same as a regular ID because until recently there's just been a lack of tools on the mainframe to make the management of these a lot easier, right? So companies are putting their own compensating controls around there. So I would say multi-factor authentication has limited adoption. Privileged access management, like I say with these privileged IDs, is certainly not adopted well. Another area I think is different is something that's very prevalent, especially in the area of threat management, is that these SIM platforms. If you're familiar with Splunk and ArcSight and IBM QRadar, that really do monitor activity, look for attack signatures and things like that. The mainframe today has limited integration with these platforms. So if you're trying to detect threats that are coming in through the mainframe, there's limited ability there, just because it's not the lack of technologies that can integrate the mainframe with Splunk, for example. It's the lack of adoption of some of these technologies, right? So just to kind of briefly summarize, I think areas that the mainframe needs to adopt better: multi-factor authentication, privileged access management, integration with some of these security information and event management platforms, right? And then just the last point is around data security. Really having the ability to understand the data landscape, right? We know there are plenty of tools on distributed platforms where you can scan and classify information. Adoption of the similar type of tools for the mainframe is critical, right? Because it's such a big data serving platform. These type of controls need to be there too.
So now that we've identified those issues, what are the best practices then people should be thinking through, especially across these security and IT teams?
So a lot of really a lot of what I was covering on that previous question. I think when we look at mainframe security to date, a lot of it has been, I would say, very much an identity-centric focus, right? It's looking, what are the identities on the mainframe? What permissions should I give these individuals? What privileged IDs and therefore, IDs with extensive privileges should be set up? That's a very identity-centric model. As a best practice, we need to not replace that, but complement that with a data-centric model. And what I mean by a data-centric model is really, instead of orienting ourselves around the identity and what that identity is allowed to do, start to look at the data on the platform. Start to understand, what data do I own, right? What classes of data do I have? How sensitive is that data? And therefore, what level of risk? So it's really kind of understanding your overall data landscape, classifying that, and then reducing the risk around those certain very sensitive classes of information. How do I protect that? How do I restrict access to that data? So now I'm tying in my identity-centric piece, because now I understand where this data is, and I may look at it and say, look, this data is accessed by everyone, and it's actually very sensitive, right? So I'm going to start reducing the permissions of certain people, etc. So bringing these two together is absolutely critical. Now, going back to the identity-centric area, just like I mentioned before, insider threat is the biggest threat we deal with today. And I don't just mean it's an insider going bad, it's an employee going bad. It could be that employee gets their credentials hijacked. So I'll stress again, multi-factor authentication is critical here, and the monitoring of these IDs, integrating with these SIM platforms like Splunk, right? So that I can monitor and look for, this user is behaving differently than they normally do, right? So that I can detect, even if someone does manage to hijack an ID and get on, I can start to monitor them and understand their behavior is different. And I may have detected a threat there, right? So summarize, implement a data-centric security model to complement an identity-centric model. Look at areas like multi-factor authentication, so you have much stronger authentication and reduce that whole insider threat. Privileged access management to put much tighter controls around your privileged IDs. And then integration with some of the security information and event management platforms like Splunk and ArcSight, right? So that you can manage or quickly detect and manage threats, when they occur. So a lot of that is really about making sure the mainframe is integrated with the broader enterprise, security discipline.
How then does that affect how I might want to think about creating an audit trail, right? Is that an event, or is that something that needs to be a little more continuous, or does it just automatically happen?
It does not automatically happen. Sorry, and you know, creating this audit trail is critical. A big part of it, like you know, I was talking before about integration with security, information, and event management platforms. That can help a lot, right? Because you know, every time an event happens, you know, somebody logs on, somebody's denied access, right? Somebody downloads thousands of records from, you know, the credit card database, right? All of these can be logged. So logging is critical, and it doesn't, you know, it doesn't have to obviously be integrated with a SIM platform, right? There's plenty of logging that goes on in the mainframe. We provide tools that not only do logging, but we detect, you know, when, you know, certain bad things are happening, right? We can, you know, detect when certain sensitive files are touched, they're changed, right? You know, we can look at, you know, when it did change, if they changed it and then changed it back to the way it was before, you know, we can still keep track of all of that stuff. So all of that, and it's, you know, switching it on, as I say, you know, if you have the ability to integrate with some of these SIM platforms too, it makes it even richer set of information. But it is critical, right? On your identity access management systems, or, you know, on the mainframe, we call them ESMs, external security managers, right? And the additional tools around that, right? Tracking, you know, all the events that happen up there is very critical. And it's not just for an audit, right? It could be if you've had an security exposure, right? You can go back and identify some of the sources of these threats and problems.
Okay, well, let's take a minute then and walk people through what is the portfolio of products and technologies that I need to put in place to master all of these aspects of the thing, and you know, and what does that CA portfolio look like?
So we have very extensive coverage of all of these areas that I've talked about. You know, those familiar with CA know that you know, we have two of the external security managers out there that, you know, have been around for decades, ACF2 and Top Secret. We've continued to enhance these products to, you know, now handle multi-factor authentication. You know, so if you want to implement multi-factor authentication and you own one of these products, it's a free of charge add-on, right? You know, we support RSA tokens if you're in the, you know, the federal space and you use PIV or CAT cards. We support that too. You know, we support various authentication standards, right? So that you can plug in your own factors as long as they're standard compliant factors. So we provide that, you know, to ACF2 Top Secret customers free of charge. We have privileged access management, right? One of the issues that many customers combat, this shared ID problem, they don't want to have shared ID, right? They don't like it. It's a huge area of exposure on an audit. What they would like to be able to do is, let's say, go back to Mike and Sarah again. They want Mike and Sarah to be able to use their own IDs, but in a critical situation, elevate their privileges temporarily, right? Now, they're trusted people. They can issue commands. They can elevate their privileges up, give them the extensive access, but they want it to be time-bound, right? So that it expires in 12 hours, 8 hours, you know, 24 hours, okay? The other thing they want to be able to do is they want to make sure, look, I don't want Mike or Sarah just elevating their privileges whenever they want. So I want to make sure there's a valid service desk ticket that's required this elevation to occur. So it does all this checking, right? So this is in the area of privileged access management. So that's another area, what we call Trusted Access Manager, or Z. That's a platform that allows that the elimination of these shared IDs, right? It makes audits much easier now, and we provide the audit trail. So anytime Sarah or Mike elevate their privileges or de-elevate, all of that stuff is logged, it's audited. It can be sent to Splunk too, right? You know, or it's kept on your own mainframe log. So very auditable, you know, system as well. On the data security side, we have actually the only tool on the mainframe that can do scanning and classification of sensitive data. We cover all the key mainframe data sets, right? You know, whether it's physical, sequential, VSAM, DB2, Datacom, you know, all these different repositories and data sets. So we cover that. We have over 150 different classifiers, right? You know, driver's licenses from, you know, all over the European Union and the US and Canada, passport numbers, social security numbers, national ID numbers, right? So we look for all this information so you can scan and classify. The other nice thing about this is it doesn't just say, look, okay, we found this sensitive data and it's over here. In that same report, we say, oh, and by the way, here are the people that have access to this information, right? And more than that, and here's who's been accessing it recently over the last 30 days, 6 months. Right? Now that's critically important because I may get a list of people that have access to this sensitive data, and then there's going to be a much shorter list of the people who have actively been accessing it, you know, over the last month. Now, that's good information because I can take that that short list and say, look, these are the people that are actually doing something with this. You know, the delta on that big list, I could probably remove their access. Now I've reduced my risk significantly. So that's why a lot of the integration that we have here is critically important. You know, understanding where the data is, who has access to it, who has been accessing it, etc. And then I think the last thing I'll cover is, you know, Mike, you mentioned about, you know, the audit trails and keeping all these logs. You know, we do manage all these logs. We do, you know, a lot of event management on the platform. And, you know, we provide tools that will integrate with Splunk and ArcSight and Logarithm and IBM QRadar, so that if you want to take all these critical events that are happening in the mainframe, merge them with a web of enterprise security on your Splunk platform or ArcSight or wherever you can, right? You know, but we will filter a lot of the events for you, so you're not sending enormous numbers of mainframe events up to Splunk. Because let's face it, you know, Splunk, it's licensed on the number of events that it handles, right? The more events you send, the more you pay for it, right? So we do filtering and enrichment and everything else there. So we really do cover the gamut and significantly help in the areas of compliance, right? And because of all the reporting that we wrap around this and the additional controls that we help add, you know, we make audits a lot easier. You know, for our clients.
All right, well, let's then move to our next polling question. And our question is, what is the state of mainframe data management within your organization? And the answers are, we know where all our sensitive mainframe data resides. B, we know where most of our sensitive mainframe data resides. C, we know where some of our sensitive mainframe data resides. And D, we have no idea where our sensitive mainframe data resides. Take a couple of minutes here to let people vote. All right, and our responses are back, and most people seem to think they know where most of their sensitive data is. There's a few folks that are a little challenged in the 11% range on both some and don't know where it is at all. Stuart, any thoughts there about, does that mirror what you see in real life?
I'm not seeing that, interestingly enough. You know, typically, you know, I've had these very candid conversations with my customers, and they're a little bit lower down that list, saying, look, to be honest with you, I really don't yet know, especially on the mainframe, I really don't yet know where everything is. If, you know, an auditor came in and pressed his finger hard on my chest and said, you know, fess up, you know, I would have to honestly admit, you know, a lot of these customers have to admit they don't really know. And it's understandable. I mean, this platform's been around for so long, it's been collecting data, it has more data than any other platform, right? It's a tough task, right? So I do find that, I mean, it's reassuring, to see that, a lot of people do know where most of their sensitive data is. A lot of my clients really don't. They're a little bit more down on the C and maybe not quite D. They're certainly on the C.
Well, as you mentioned earlier, that sharp end of the stick may put a lot of focus on the equation, right?
Right, yeah, certainly.
All right, so our next question here is to ask you about what is the organizational structure that people need to implement? I mean, are there processes and procedures around the senior leadership that people need to think through? I mean, who are the major players when it comes to mainframe compliance?
Another good point. Because it's often people think, oh, you know what, we've got compliance, let's say around data security, so security department go figure it out, right? And if you're leaving it just for the security department to figure it out, you're going to fail, right? Because you can't secure everything, right? You can make things absolutely secure, but you also make it absolutely unusable, right? So what happens is the business lines need to be involved, right? You need to understand what is important to the business, right? So that I can start to prioritize what needs to be secured, what needs to be protected, what needs to be in compliance, etc. Right? So you need that prioritized list. So it's critical that you work with kind of the business line leaders to understand that. The other area that's critical too is the risk and compliance office. Right? These are the ones that understand that these are the regulations, these are the internal policies and procedures that are most important to this organization. Every business, every industry is different, right? So your risk and compliance office is going to be critical there. Now, clearly, IT security is a very important player. So, we've got the business lines, right? We've got risk and compliance office. We've got certainly IT security. But IT operations is important too. If you remember earlier on the call, I highlighted that change management introduces some of the biggest vulnerabilities. If you make a change, you're probably going to introduce some vulnerabilities. And operations typically have responsibility for that. They need to be involved because changes will need to be made. You need to make sure you have the right change management in place. Before I start saying we need pretty much everyone in the company, let me add one more critical area is finance. Right? So much of this data that is sensitive, that needs to be protected, is financial. There are so many controls and regulations, brought forward by the SEC. You've got SOX and PCI and all these different things too. Finance has to be involved because that's a critical set of data, right? I'll stop there. I'm just trying to highlight that this is not solely the responsibility of IT security. And it needs to come to the top that everyone is accountable for this and everyone has a responsibility to make sure, it's effective and audits are not failed in these particular areas.
All right, well, let's then go to our next polling question, which is, does your organization have a chief risk officer? The answers are pretty simple. Yes, no, we're evaluating the role, or you just don't know. And while we're collecting those responses, we'll see how things turn out. And we're just about there, I think. All right, and here we have our responses. 38% yes, 23% no, 23% evaluating the role, 15% I don't know. There's some really honest folks on this webinar, I must say. Stuart, what do you think about that? Is that what you see out there in the world?
I think that's fairly typical. A lot of time it depends on the size of the organization. Very large organizations will certainly have a risk officer. It's a core discipline. Smaller organizations, may not. It can't be afforded. And what basically happens is management of risk becomes part of key employees rather than an individual that's responsible in the company. So I think that's a very typical response what I'd expect to see.
All right, great. All right, and now let's move to our next topic, which is gaining a competitive advantage. I think a lot of folks tend to think of compliance as a cost center, but I'm curious, what are your thoughts about the business benefits to compliance and what the need for that compliance really does for the business?
So I think this is actually a very important point, because once we start if we treat compliance as a chore, a horrible necessity, yeah, it's painful and we won't be as good at it. If we start treating compliance as a business benefit, and by the way, it is a business benefit if it's done properly, right? Then it becomes, part of your DNA, okay? And honestly, compliance can be a core business benefit because let's look at it, right? One of the areas you're going to manage in business is risk, right? If you don't manage risk properly, you can have catastrophic failures, right? Whether you lose your IT systems, you lose money, right? You lose finances, etc. So look at it that the reason I'm trying to be compliant is I'm trying to protect my business, right? The other piece to it is, like we talked in one of the previous questions about who's involved in compliance. It's kind of everybody. So the business line, you're understanding your strategies, right? What is important to the company, and I'm managing compliance to make sure we continue to execute on our business strategies, right? I'm managing the risk that could prevent us from executing on those strategies. So when you start to look at compliance as a means of helping us achieve our business goals, right, you're going to get much more alignment in the company. And I think that kind of mindset, adopting that culture, is very critical. It's really kind of, let's say, compliance around me meeting my business goals, right? Now, you could easily argue, well, a GDPR audit, right? That's just going to happen. It's mandatory. I'm going to have to deal with that, whether or not it affects my business strategy or not. But it does, because I'm not going to name names of companies. It's unfair. We all know who they are. Companies that have had massive data breaches, right? Their CEOs have been fired. Their reputation has been destroyed, and significant valuations from their significant portions of the company valuation have been eroded, right? So GDPR is working in a very critical area that if not managed properly, I mean PII, personally identified information. If it's not managed properly, it can have catastrophic consequences for businesses, right? So just really look at compliance as, or let's say manage compliance as a business benefit rather than an ugly necessity.
All right, I want to remind everybody that we have some questions here if you're inclined to share with us. But Stuart, there's one question here I'm going to pass to you, which is, in what ways can computer audit tools automatically generate query logs and test sequences that are saved as working papers in some form or another? Can I capture all that stuff, I guess, is what our attendee wants to know.
So I'm hoping I'm interpreting the question properly. So when we talk about computer audit tools, right, a lot of these are attached to existing tools, right? Security managers, data scanning and classification tools, compliance management tools, etc. It is a case of again understanding what is key, what are the priorities around the business, right? Enabling these tools to capture the data that is important, and setting up these reports, right? That basically report on this data in such a way that they're aligned with whatever the auditor is looking for, right? So when I build a report, I want to make sure I'm building a GDPR report or a PCI report that is basically capturing the necessary portions of data and aligning them in a report, right? So for example, I'm getting audited for PCI. I'm collecting log information from my security managers to show who has access to this credit card information, right? I am pulling from my data scanning tools to say I know where this information is, right? And in addition to that, I'm showing that I have the controls in place to prove to an auditor that I am managing all of this, right? So it's key, it's logging, and it's also extracting those logs in alignment with a report that makes it easier for an auditor to read, right? Because again, you don't want these audits to be time. You make the audit's job easier, your job's going to be easier in the longer term.
All right, and then we have one more question here about how do auditors view security patching? Do they understand when an organization is unable to patch certain systems? Are they forgiving of that matter, or what is their general perspective on the whole patch management process?
Yeah, great question. So auditors, again, it depends on the type of audit, if that is going to be covered. So if you're auditing, in the general area of vulnerabilities, right? Because that's what patching is all about. Vulnerabilities are identified, and I have to be able to, prove that I am patching the system. Now, I think one of the reasons this question, good question, gets raised is because sometimes it is not possible to provide a patch to the system. That patch may affect something else. The organization may be so large that rolling that patch out in a necessary time frame, is just not possible. And it goes back to that point I mentioned earlier, is then you have to be able to work with the auditor and say, look, here are the reasons why, right? Now, the auditor may or may not be understanding, but what is important, and this is how you will get much better compliance from the auditor, sorry to use that word, but is to say that although I'm not rolling this patch out in the appropriate time frame, I do have some compensating controls that is reducing the risk. Now that's key there, right, is these compensating controls to prove that you're reducing the risk of this vulnerability, while you figure out how to, apply the patch and let's say eliminate this vulnerability. So the key point here is when you're working with an auditor, at least have an attempt to provide some compensating control that reduces the risk of this vulnerability.
All right, so you will get points for trying, but
You will. Yeah.
I just want to ask you one other question here. Everybody gets graded, I guess, on passing the audit, but does anybody ever get graded for how long the audit takes or making sure that the audit time is reduced? Because audits are somewhat disruptive by nature, right?
Yeah, and the business managers will provide those grades, right? So, if audits take an extensive period of time, they're tying up staff for longer periods of time, work isn't getting done, okay? And that's punitive to the business, right? So that's one of the worst parts about audits are the cost and effort, and that's where the clients I'm working with, that's where one of their biggest focus areas. One of the biggest focus areas is around reducing that cost and effort, right? Putting better tools in, putting better reporting in, and better automation, right? So you'll see a lot of that because otherwise, the business managers will come down and penalize the areas that are not putting the tools and the automation and the reporting in because their staff are being tied up unnecessarily, etc. So that's where you get the bad marks is a lot of the business managers whose businesses are being affected.
All right, Stuart, any final thoughts?
I think no, this has been really good. I mean, I've enjoyed these questions, Mike. I just the only thing I'll pass on is that there are a lot of tools out there. We love working in this area. It's probably the area that gets the most focus, from the security department within CA. Please work with us. Please ask additional questions. Offline as well. I love this subject. I love helping in this area, and just be compliant. Thank you.
Hey, Stuart, thanks for spending some time with us today.
Oh, thank you. It's been great. Really enjoyed it.
All right, and thank you all for spending time with both Stuart and I. We wish you the best of luck in your future compliance endeavors. This will be recorded. You can find it on securityboulevard.com as well as probably devops.com. And good luck in the rest of your day.